If your wife wasn't home at 10 o'clock at night, would you worry? I wouldn't, because all I have to do is turn on the local news to see exactly what she's doing. My wife, Carol Martin, is the local evening news co-anchor on a leading local television station here in Birmingham. She's as beautiful as she is smart, and many moneymakers are starting to bet that her next job will be in a major media market like Atlanta or Chicago. There are even rumors that she may receive an offer from a New York station, which is the promised land for news anchors. By the way, I'm Tom Bailey. Carol kept her maiden name for on-air purposes. Many female TV presenters do this to keep their personal and professional lives separate. I think it is already clear to you that I am proud of her, and that I am lucky to be her husband. We met while we were both attending the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. As you may have guessed, she majored in broadcasting and I majored in marketing. We met in a student club in our first year, and I was shocked. She was tall, blonde, and had curves in all the right places. And I'm a pretty outgoing guy, but I'm not an athlete, and I wasn't destined to be the big man on campus. And for some reason, no one ever asked me to model clothes for Gentleman's Quarterly magazine. But something seemed to click between us, and soon we became a couple. I won't lie to you and tell you that everything was always perfect. We had our share of fights, and once we even broke up for 2 weeks. But by the second weekend, I was going crazy, missing her and beating myself up for letting everything that happened come between us. Finally, I ran across campus to her dorm, hoping she would forgive me and we would meet again. Halfway there, I looked up and saw her running in my direction. If there had been a movie camera, it would have circled the two of us as we tearfully held each other and vowed never to be apart again. We, as they say, went crazy with love. By our senior year, we were engaged. We were already living together in a small off-campus apartment, but at least we were smart enough to wait until we graduated before tying the knot. Besides, she wanted to have a big wedding, and her parents were wealthy enough to spoil her. I was smart enough to let them have their way, so we got married in Canterbury Chapel on campus in May. A week after classes started, Carol was lucky enough to get a job at a local television and radio station in Huntsville as a weekend weather anchor. It's not exactly a prestigious position, but broadcasting jobs are hard to come by, even in small markets. But it was a start, and Carol made the most of it. Within 6 months, she was given the opportunity to report live, and after a few months, she moved into the role of a regular reporter. I managed to find a low-level job at a local advertising agency. The establishment was so small that I did double duty as an accountant and a copyist. It wasn't much, but it was a good experience and much better than being unemployed. But I didn't have to stay long because Carol's star was already on the rise. By the end of the year, she was offered a job as a reporter at the largest station in Mobile. Her looks and charming personality caught the attention of the broadcast station, and we moved to the Gulf Coast. I actually didn't mind being on the sidelines in our relationship. I knew this would happen from the moment Carol got her first on-air job, and my ego was strong enough to support her career. Of course, this was not unnecessary, because when we moved to Mobile, she earned more than me. The management of the station in Mobile had close ties to local advertising agencies, and with their help, I was able to find a job with one of the largest firms in the city. People were nice, and I had no problems. Meanwhile, Carol felt even better. She joined the station as a reporter, but when a position opened up, she was given a chance as a weekend newscaster. People loved her, and the ratings for her newscast began to rise steadily. It wasn't long before she moved on to the coveted position of co-anchor on the evening news. If the public loved her as a simple presenter, then she went crazy when Carol announced her pregnancy on air. As our beautiful little girl grew and developed, the broadcast station took the opportunity to produce a series of documentaries about the challenges faced by the mother of a newborn returning to work. The episode won a regional Emmy Award. Given all the success Carol had enjoyed, it was no surprise when WXYY, a leading network in Birmingham, offered her a co-anchor position. We had become accustomed to the laid-back pace of life on the bayfront in Mobile, and we were sad to say goodbye. I made several real friends at the agency where I worked, and I sincerely regretted that I had to leave them. But Birmingham beckoned, and we couldn't help but think that if Carol succeeded there could be even greater things to come. We sold our cozy house, packed our things, and headed to the big city. Some people might scoff at calling Birmingham a big city, but with a population of 1.2 million people and the 40th largest media market in the country, South Pittsburgh was a big step forward for Carol, especially in the field of broadcast media. After feeling so comfortable in Mobile, I was apprehensive about moving to Birmingham, but I didn't have to worry about anything. Armed with great recommendations from my friends in Mobile and the help of the Birmingham station, I was able to land a great job with the second largest advertising agency in the city. I really can't say enough about running the station. We were set up to meet with an experienced real estate agent who helped us find a wonderful home in the Hoover suburbs. She was also able to help us find a wonderful child care provider for little Susan. Overall, the move was much easier than I expected, and we quickly and painlessly settled in and started our new life. I have to share a little about our daily routine because being the husband of a TV presenter is not a normal lifestyle. In the morning, I got up, made myself breakfast, and went to work, leaving Carol and Susan to sleep. Carol stayed in bed as long as Susan allowed her to, and then got up and spent the morning with her daughter. After lunch, Carol took Susan to Mrs. Alsop's house. Mrs. Alsop was a wonderful woman who cared for Susan and two other children, as well as her own daughter. She had an elementary education, so in addition to playtime, she gave her charges an early introduction to some of the concepts they might encounter in kindergarten and first grade. I would pick up Susan after she left work, bring her home, and prepare dinner for us, including something that could be saved for Carol to eat when she got home. After dinner, I bathed Susan and read to her until it was time to put her to bed. Then I read or watched TV until I finally got to Carol's house. Often she had to wake me up on the couch where I had fallen asleep. As for Carol, after taking Susan to Mrs. Alsop, she headed to the station and arrived there at 3 in the evening to begin preparing for the evening news. Then, while the network news was on, Carol went off to do her makeup and do one last review before going on air at 6 p.m. She and co-anchor Ted Stevenson were preparing to host a full hour of local news. After it was over, they had a light snack. They never ate close to broadcast time to avoid an unpleasant burp or stomach rumbling, and prepared for the final news at 10 p.m. Carol and Ted usually took turns anchoring the 10-hour news block. Since the breaking news was only 30 minutes long, only one anchor was needed. But lately, news director Don Sanchez had been debriefing after breaking news, and Carol and Ted had to stay late into the night to get criticism of their performance and find room for improvement. Local news programs bring in a lot of money for TV stations. Stations get all their revenue from advertising, and the highest-rated stations charge a premium, so competition is fierce. The higher the rating, the higher the premium, so stations are always looking for ways to increase their audience share. Being in the advertising business, I could understand why the radio station was so focused on increasing ratings. But as a husband, I also felt a lack of time to be alone with Carol. In truth, with Carol working in the evenings and me working during the day, it was always difficult to find time for just the two of us, especially after Susan was born. Of course, we usually had weekends, but we tried to find some time during the week. But lately, these nightly meetings had become less and less frequent, especially after Don Sanchez had appointed nightly debriefings. Even our weekends got shorter as Carol made more public appearances to support the broadcast station. Given the rare opportunities for intimacy, Carol and I seemed to live more like roommates than husband and wife, friends rather than lovers. Because our schedules didn't match, I rarely found an opportunity to discuss the situation with her, and she seemed reluctant to talk about it with me. I think because there were no easy answers. Even though I was unhappy with the current situation, I didn't want to push for this conversation because when I married Carol, I knew what I was getting into. We talked about schedules and marriage problems with a TV presenter, and I agreed the whole time. In fact, we had friends from college who struggled with the opposite situation. husbands who traveled frequently and worked long hours, with little time to spend with their families. If I had been in this situation, I would have turned to Carol for support and understanding, so I didn't want to be a hypocrite. And all the time I reminded myself that Carol earns much more than me, which made our life much easier. However, money isn't everything. It got to the point where I could no longer keep my frustration to myself, and one day I vented to Lou Faraday, the director of media services at our agency, over lunch. Lou was only a couple of years older than me, married to a lovely woman named Terry, and had a little girl only a little older than Susan. With so much in common, it's no wonder he became my best friend at work, someone I felt comfortable turning to for advice. That day, when he was telling me how happy he and Terry were, I instinctively blurted out, "Damn, I wish I could live like you. Looks like there's trouble in paradise, buddy," he said. "What's the matter?" Then it all came out, surprising me with how bad I felt. "I'm married to one of the hottest women on television," I said, "and I don't see her much more often than her fans watch her on the news." Lou shook his head sympathetically. "Damn, Tom, this sucks. Couldn't you two go on vacation or even a long weekend? I bet your parents will be happy to keep Susan." "I thought about it," I said, "but Carol says Don Sanchez is putting pressure on her and Ted to get better ratings. These are his hits, and he is afraid that their disappearance will lead to some kind of loss that they will not be able to compensate for." "Listen," Lou replied, "I've known Don Sanchez for a long time. He is a talented news commentator and strives for success, but he is also a decent person. Maybe you should just talk to him and see if there's anything he can do to give you and Carol some time together." "I don't know, Lou," I sighed. "I think Carol will kill me if she finds out that I contacted her boss." "She doesn't need to know," Lou replied. "Don will come to the agency tomorrow to listen to a presentation of a new viral video campaign we are working on. You know him well enough. I bet you can talk to him for a few minutes after we're done." "I don't want to screw this up, Lou," I said. "My personal problems do not apply to office problems." "Do not be silly. This is just a preliminary meeting. Don wants to see how our concept works for him, so we invited him to come over. There will be a great opportunity for you to take him aside and talk to him about you and Carol." I was still afraid, but I couldn't think of a better idea. My resolve was strengthened that night when Carol arrived even later than usual. She didn't even bother to wake me up on the couch where I was dozing, waiting for her. Instead, I woke up on it in the middle of the night to find the TV turned off and a wet pillow that I'd been drooling on in my sleep. I trudged upstairs, undressed, and climbed into bed next to her sleeping figure. Damn, I thought, now I don't even have the chance to kiss her goodnight. Walking into the office the next day, I was determined to do something to try and change what our lives had become. So I kept a close eye on the conference room where Don Sanchez was meeting with Lou and some of his guys. As their meeting was winding down, I stuck my head in the door and waved to Don. He was clearly in a good mood. "Hey, Tom, how is my favorite news anchor's husband doing?" he shouted at me. "Hello, Don. Good to see you. Listen, do you have a couple of minutes?" I asked. "Of course. What do you have there?" he asked cheerfully. I decided it was time to start. "Hey, please give Carol a break. You're making her work too much," I said, frowning. But he took me seriously, and there was concern on his face. "Was she complaining?" he asked quickly. "No, she likes everything," I answered. "But I suffer. I don't see her anymore." At this, he relaxed. "Well, you knew she had a dangerous job when you married her," he joked. I saw that he was glad that his star presenter had no complaints. "Of course," I agreed. "But all these special performances and post-show showdowns are actually taking away from my time with her." I tried to soften my complaint with a wink. Okay, he replied. "We probably went overboard with showing our flag. I'll see if I can shorten the schedule there. And you have no reason to worry about analyzes. We have not conducted them even once since the last ratings came out. Have you seen how far we are ahead of our competitors? The station management is delighted." "Speaking of management," he continued, "I must return to my next meeting." "I was glad to see you. May your beloved be happy." With these words, he slapped me on the back, turned, and headed towards the door, leaving me standing in his office. Back at my desk, All I could think about was when the latest rankings came out. I checked my computer. Our agency is a subscriber. And sure enough, the latest ratings were posted a full month ago. So, if Dawn didn't debrief for a month, what was Carol doing all those evenings when she got home so late from work? The question shook me to the core. Maybe it was because I was already unhappy with our relationship, but the first thought that struck me was, she's having an affair. The minute I thought about it, I knew I had to be wrong. Carol loved me, and although things were a little tense, she didn't do anything to jeopardize our marriage. Besides, there were many other perfectly reasonable reasons why she was returning so late. Maybe she just wanted to relax a little. Maybe go out for a late-night snack. Maybe she didn't have time to respond to her fan mail and was trying to catch up. There were many reasons why she might need to stick around. So why didn't I feel better? At that moment, Lou poked his head through the door. "Hey, I saw you talking to Don. Did he give you any relief?" "I'm not sure, Lou. I guess I won't know until I talk to Carol." He looked at me questioningly, but when I didn't say anything, he turned to leave. "Okay, buddy. Let me know if there's anything I can do." I was like a zombie for the rest of the day. I did my best, and anyone walking by my office would think I was working hard. But I couldn't concentrate on any of my projects. I kept coming back to what Dawn said. I kept trying to remember what Carol had said when I asked her about her late return. Most of all, I thought about what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront her and demand an explanation. But as soon as I chose this option, another part of me thought how stupid I would look if there was a completely innocent explanation. I knew that accusing her of having an affair would do nothing to improve the relationship between Carol and I. Then, as I rationalized my fears, another voice in my head began calling me a weakling for not making claims and demanding the truth. By the time I left work to pick up Susan, I was no closer to a solution than before. The only good thing was that I now had an active, demanding 4-year-old with me, and being her father took up most of my attention and energy for the next few hours. Perhaps she sensed my mood because she was unusually clingy that evening and did not want me to stop reading to her in bed. Finally, she fell asleep. Tiptoeing out of the room, I looked back at her sleeping, innocent face and was surprised to find tears in her eyes. How sad it will be if her mom and dad decide to divorce. Emotionally exhausted, I returned to my office and plopped down in front of the TV. And then I realized that I didn't have the strength for confrontation. I spent an hour watching some pointless police drama, but then I couldn't remember the plot. Then the news broke, and I watched my beautiful wife review the day's events. Looking at her carefully made-up face during the talking head filming, I remembered how I was so captivated by her all those years ago in college. Of course, this bright, beautiful woman would not cheat on me. It was well after midnight when I heard her car pull into the driveway, and she walked in from the garage. She was amazed to see me. "About? I didn't think you were still awake." I got up from the couch, walked up to her and hugged her. "I just wanted to see you. I missed you. You're terribly late tonight." She kissed me quickly and pulled away to lean over and take off her shoes. "Yeah, sorry. Don kept us on one of his damn debriefings again," she said. "I'm really broken, darling. I'll go to bed." Without waiting for me, she turned and headed up the stairs. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark. "Oh my God," I thought. She lied to me. And again, the opposing sides raised a debate in my head. Maybe she didn't lie. Maybe Don called another debriefing session. This doesn't make any sense. Don said today that he hasn't done a debriefing in a month. And after you raise this issue, he will definitely not call a special meeting tonight. I didn't want to believe that my wife was cheating on me. But I also didn't want to be an unwitting cuckold, keeping my head in the sand instead of facing the truth. What was true? When I went up to the bedroom, Carol was already fast asleep. I lay down next to her, but for a long time I could not fall asleep. The next day, I walked into Lou's office and asked him to have lunch with me. When he looked at me, he must have seen something in my face that prevented him from making his usual joke. "And Lou," I added, "please plan a long lunch." Now he looked at me very seriously, but just nodded and said, "Of course, buddy." I walked up to his office around 11:15 and suggested we eat at a place a couple of miles from the office where we were unlikely to run into anyone else from work. We drove to the restaurant in silence. I didn't want to go into details and had to stop, and he realized that I was not interested in idle chatter. When we ordered lunch, I sat there for a minute, not knowing where to start. He looked at me sympathetically and said, "This is Carol, isn't it?" His comment was like opening a boil, and it seemed to me that all this nasty infectious pus began to flow out of me. He listened silently, allowing me to express all my fears and doubts. When I finally finished, he shook his head. "Damn, I would never have believed it. I thought you and Carol had the happiest marriage in the world." "Me too, Lou, me too." I nodded sadly. "So what are you gonna do?" he asked. His simple question seemed to give my thoughts a special shape. I realized I had to do something. I couldn't sit in agony any longer. "Lou," I said, "the only thing I can think of is to go to the station and see for myself what's going on. If I'm wrong and it's all completely innocent, I hope I can get out of there undetected and Carol will never know what an insecure idiot I was." "What if you turn out to be right?" Lou asked quietly. "I don't know, Lou, but at least I'll know the truth. It's better than the agony I'm going through right now." "What about Susan?" he asked. "I've already thought about that," I told him. "When we get back from lunch, I'll call Mrs. Alsop and ask if she can keep Susan with her tonight. She's suggested doing this before, so hopefully it won't be a problem." We finished lunch and returned to the office. I was still confused, but at least I decided to do something to resolve the situation. I think even the condemned feel relieved when the day of execution finally arrives. Mrs. Alsop said she would be happy to help me, but asked me not to be late. "Please come back no later than 11 in the evening," she told me. "I have to get up early in the morning. I didn't have much time to see anything, but it was the best I could get." So I promised. After work, I drove back to Mrs. Alsop's house to tell Susan about the change in my plans. At first, my little girl cried when she realized I wouldn't take her, but Mrs. Alsop came to the rescue. "We'll have a pizza party, Susan," she said, and Susan brightened up at the thought. I paid Mrs. Alsop for the extra time and also gave money to order pizza for everyone. It was the least I could do. Then I left before Susan got upset again. Now the only question was how to kill a few hours. I went home and made myself something to eat. Then he continued to pick at his plate for half an hour before scraping the food into the trash can. I realized that I couldn't eat. I cleaned up the kitchen and pottered around the house, looking for a way to distract myself. The more I thought about it, the worse my plan seemed to me. The news won't end until 10:30, but what could happen in the next 30 minutes? What's worse is if Carol comes straight home. She might pass me on the way home before I can pick up Susan and come back. What should I tell her then? All these doubts and fears paralyzed me until I remembered the determination I felt at lunch with Lou. I had to do something even if I failed. I just couldn't let things go the way they did. By then, it was almost 10 o'clock in the evening. My plan was to come to the station while the news was broadcast, go into the studio shortly before the news ended, and see what I could see. Usually there weren't many people at the station this late, only an engineer, 2 cameramen, and a sound engineer. Hopefully there won't be any other visitors and I can stay out of sight. Arriving at the studio, I immediately realized my mistake. Old John, the night watchman, was sitting in the hall. I completely forgot about him. He knew me from previous visits, so there was no problem getting in, but I would have to register. I tried in vain to remain unnoticed. When he saw me enter, he looked at me curiously. "Good evening, Mr. Bailey," he said. "Have you come to see the news?" "That's right," I said, and signed his logbook. He strangely looked at me with a sympathetic look. "Will there be any problems?" "Oh, no, of course not," I quickly replied and walked further into the studio. What did he mean by that? Became interested. Then it dawned on me. He knows. Oh, shit. I walked back to the set and looked through the thick curtains. The news had just ended and Carol was taking her microphone off her lapel. She then headed back to her dressing room. I circled the studio to follow her, but to my surprise, Carol did not enter her dressing room. Instead, she headed down the hallway to the green room. The green room is an area where guests can wait and relax before going on air. But there are no guests on the 10 o'clock news, I thought. And indeed, the whole area was in darkness. However, when she opened the door, I saw that one of the table lamps was burning inside, and I also noticed a male figure sitting on one of the soft chairs. Then the door closed, and there was no light or sound from inside. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know what to do. The door was not locked, so I could burst in and demand an explanation. But what if this is an innocent meeting? If, for example, Don Sanchez is there? Carol will never forgive me for this. But if I stay outside, I'll never know what's going on. Just as I decided to rush in, to hell with the consequences, I remembered something. There was a small window at the far end of the room, allowing station staff to discreetly keep an eye on guests without disturbing them. In fact, it was Carol who pointed it out to me when giving me a tour of the station when we first arrived. I quickly walked to the side where the observation window was located. On the way, I looked at the time. Crap. It was already 10:45. I'll have to leave quickly to get to Mrs. Alsop's house by 11. I walked down a darkened hallway and saw a faint light coming from a small viewing window. Looking inside, I saw Carol clearly. She took off her dress and stood there in only a thin black bra, a garter belt, the stockings themselves, and black panties. I've never seen underwear like this in my life. She was wrapped in a tight embrace by a man who was running his hands over her back and ass as if he owned her, which I assume he was doing at the moment. They merged in a passionate kiss. I pulled out my cell phone and started shooting video. The light level was low, but the black underwear seemed to make the glow of her skin much brighter. The man slid both hands to her buttocks and pressed her tightly against his groin. I could almost hear her passionate moan as she arched her back. As she leaned back, I realized that the man hugging her was none other than her co-host, Ted Stevenson. She then slipped out of his arms and began to unbutton his pants. I realized what was going to happen next, and I wanted to put an end to it right now. But when he turned and headed towards the door, he looked at his watch. It was almost 11:55. Damn it, I have to pick up Susan. I ran down the hall to the lobby, nodding to Joe, and headed for the front door. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Bailey," he said. Damn it, I thought. So everyone besides me knows what's going on? I jumped into the car and exceeded the speed limit, speeding to Mrs. Alsop's house. When she let me in, I found that Susan was already asleep. After wrapping her in a blanket, I picked her up, took her things, and turned to leave, thanking Mrs. Alsop for keeping her. She looked at me strangely and asked, "Are you okay, Mr. Bailey?" When I looked at her blankly, she said, "Your eyes." Only then did I realize that tears were flowing down my cheeks. "Oh, that," I said. "It's okay. Something just got into my eye when I got out of the car." I thanked her again and carried Susan to the car, buckling her into her seatbelt, even though she was still wrapped in the blanket. I don't think she woke up on the way home, and I know she continued to sleep while I carried her up the stairs and into bed. She looked so sweet and innocent, and I was filled with longing for the innocence I had lost tonight. I took a beer out of the refrigerator and sat in the dark office, waiting. Everything was quiet. Oddly enough, my grandmother's death flashed through my head. I entered the chapel where her urn stood, and then I felt silence, aggravated by my deep sadness. It was the same now. It was almost 1 in the morning when Carol returned home. She entered the kitchen and turned on the light. Noticing my figure in the unlit room, she was surprised. "Tom, what are you doing there?" "I was waiting for you," I said in an even, emotionless voice. "The security guard said that you came to the studio. Is Susan okay?" "Where is she?" "Mrs. Alsop held it for me. She's upstairs in bed now." "Well, if you came to the studio, why didn't you come to me?" I tried to pull myself together. "It's all over. I saw you this evening. I saw you walk into Ted Stevenson's green room." "Oh yes, we had a small meeting after the news." "Carol, I was approaching the observation window. I saw what kind of meeting you had. I even got to see the new set of underwear that you were hiding from me." At least, she had the decency to look embarrassed. "Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry." Now my anger was growing. Are you sorry you did it, or are you just sorry you got caught? Tom, I'm sorry you saw us. I didn't want you to find out like that, she said quietly. Are you going to leave me for him? She fell to her knees in front of me and grabbed my hands. Oh, honey, don't even think about it. Of course I'm not going to leave you. It's just a little adventure, a little affair. It will probably end soon, and then everything will return to normal. I couldn't believe my ears. Will it end soon? Are you saying you're not going to stop? Are you going to continue to cheat on me? Baby, it doesn't mean anything. This is just a chance for me to experiment a little with Ted. It's not for long. Just let me have my fun, and then I'll come back to you like always. I can't believe it, Carol. You're asking me to agree to be a cuckold while you two make out sex whenever you want, until you lose consciousness? How could you think that I would agree to this? She stood up and stepped back to look at me. Her voice was quiet and had lost all its warmth. Tom, in fact, no one here cares about your opinion. Nobody cares? For God's sake, I am your husband. If you don't stop this, I will have no choice but to file for divorce. She looked at me coldly. I don't really think it's in your best interest, Tom. Her calm demeanor angered me even more. I wanted her to express some remorse, ask for forgiveness, or at least acknowledge some of the pain I felt. Instead, she forced me to accept her behavior and pretend nothing was happening. I could not believe it. Given your actions tonight, I will be the one to decide what is in my best interests. And I can tell you right now that I am not going to put up with this. She crossed her arms and spoke to me as if she were lecturing to a lost child. Tom, listen to me. If you file for divorce, you will be the only one who loses everything, completely. You will lose your daughter because the court will award custody of Susan to me. You'll only be able to be with her maybe a couple of weekends a month, plus your birthday and a few holidays. Regardless of how we divide our assets, I will get the house because I will be raising Susan. And of course, even if you don't pay child support, you'll still have to pay child support. Wait, I shouted. It was you who committed adultery. Tom, there is no guilt requirement in this state. The court doesn't care who did what. All it cares about is the well-being of the children. In the case of a 4-year-old girl, the mother receives custody each time. She paused to catch her breath and then continued. If you don't believe me, go to a lawyer and ask. You'll find that I know what I'm talking about. Her tone softened. You don't want this to happen, do you, Tom? I don't want that either. I want our family to remain intact. This little adventure that I'm going through now shouldn't affect us. Just think about it. As I sat down in the chair, she came over and kissed the top of my head. Just think about it, Tom. Now I'll go to bed. Having said this, she turned and headed up the stairs. I don't know how long I sat there. Thoughts flashed on and off in my head, and each of them evoked different emotions. Anger, loss, disbelief, sadness, confusion, fear, rage, disappointment. I felt like I had to make some plans, do something, but I had no idea what. That Carol would cheat on me was unthinkable. That she suggested continuing her affair was so beyond my imagination that I felt paralyzed. Finally, I rose to my feet and trudged up the stairs, exhausted from the roller coaster of events and emotions I had experienced this evening. I fell heavily into bed and fell asleep almost immediately. Even though I was dead tired, my body automatically woke up at 6 in the morning the next day. I automatically took a shower, shaved, and got dressed. Wild impulses came to mind, to run and hide, or to wake Carol and knock some sense into her, or to kidnap Susan, or just go back to bed and never get up again. But as I walked into Susan's room to look at her sleeping figure, I knew I had to keep my sanity for her sake. Doing something stupid would only get me into trouble and would probably cost me the chance to keep my beautiful daughter. I knew I had to put her first and be strong for her. It so happened that I completed my morning routine and headed to the office, like every day. I was able to go on autopilot and complete all the tasks required for the job. But as soon as I arrived and sat down at my table, all reflexes left me, and I lowered my head on the table in a daze. Volume? It was Lou. Are you all right? When I didn't answer, he walked into my office and closed the door behind him. What happened? He asked worriedly. So I told him every sordid detail of last night's conversation, as best I could remember. Once I started, I couldn't stop. Lou sat with a stunned expression on his face. He was shocked when I told him what I saw in the green room, but what shocked him most was Carol's attitude toward her affair. "Damn," he said. "She had the nerve to tell you to accept her betrayal so easily." When I finally finished, he sat up and looked me in the eyes. "Listen," he said, "Carol has changed. I don't know what happened to her. Maybe success went to her head, but she's not the same woman I met when you guys moved here. This means that you must reconsider your reaction to her. You can no longer assume she has your best interests at heart. Now you need to take care of yourself, buddy." He got up. "And the first thing you need to do is consult a lawyer. I can't believe she can get away with this crap. You can't rely on what she says, you have to find out for yourself." "Damn it, Lou," I replied. "I don't know a single lawyer in Birmingham." "And this is where I come in handy for you," he smiled. "My college roommate became a lawyer, and he practices here in town. I bet if I ask him, he'll meet with you today. Let me go out and make a call." With that, he left. He soon returned to my office with a piece of paper. "Gotta love those old school friends," he sang. "You have an appointment today at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Here is his name and address. He is waiting for you. You are my savior, Lou. At least this gives me some hope." "No problem, buddy. After you meet him, come back and tell me what he says." The meeting with the lawyer did not go as I had hoped. He shook my hand and invited me into his office, and then asked me to tell my story. I shared the highlights with him and then got to what I really wanted to know. What are my options for divorce? "Tom," he said, "every breakup used to have a good side and a bad side. The court listened to the dispute between the two sides, and then apportioned blame. There was no winner in this situation, his word against hers. It was impossible to determine who was right and who was wrong. Trials took too long and bogged down the judicial system. In the end, someone came up with the idea of no guilt. This means that if no crime has been committed, the court does not need to consider who did what. All he has to do is decide on a fair division of the family property and the welfare of all minor children. It turned out to be easier for everyone." "Okay," I said, "but what does this mean for me personally?" He sighed. "In short, this means that what Carol told you is true. If she is not a bad mother, namely, she uses drugs, commits criminal neglect, and the like, then the court will give her custody of your daughter. We can talk about expanded visitation rights, but Susan will be living with Carol, and Carol will largely determine how often you can see your daughter. And although Carol earns more than you will still contribute to the costs of raising your daughter in the form of a child contribution." "What about the house?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Well, the two of you bought the house together, so it is your joint asset, which will be divided between you. But the court's primary concern is the welfare of the children, and it does not like to deprive children of their homes unnecessarily. So the most likely outcome is that Carol will remain in the house until Susan turns 18. You can then both put the house on the market and divide the asset according to the final settlement of the property. But for the next 14 years, the house would be hers. But in a few years, she will most likely move to another media market," I objected. "Then you can sell the house. But until that happens, she will remain in it." I sat shaking my head. Damn, she knew exactly what she was talking about. I screwed up. "Sorry," he told me when we shook hands. "This is not always fair, but it is the law." On the way back to the office, I felt like I had been sent to purgatory. I couldn't figure out what sin I had committed, but I was damn sure I was being punished. Lou was eagerly waiting for me to return, but with just one glance at my face, he already knew the result, without me even having to speak. "Damn it, Lou," I said, "that's just not fair. She tied me up, and there's nothing I can do about it. She can act like a bitch, and if I don't want to give up my daughter and my home, I have to smile and bear it all." I started rushing around the office. "I'm beginning to understand why some men kill their wives." "Don't even joke about it, Tom," Lou hastened to say. "I know you want her out of your life, but if something happens to her, I don't want to give evidence that you were here threatening her." "Okay, okay," I agreed. "I can't and would never do anything like that. I just feel like an ancient navigator, and she's like an albatross around my neck." Walking past the window in my office, I looked out and groaned. There was a billboard that had just been installed across the street. On it was a giant photograph of Carol and Ted Stevenson staring at me, with the caption, "Birmingham's choice for the 6 o'clock news." "You see," I said to Lou, pointing to the billboard, "I can't escape her even here." Lou walked over and looked at the new sign. "WXYY certainly likes the ratings these two are getting." Then a strange expression appeared on his face. "Interesting, interesting," he muttered. Then he turned to me. "How desperate are you to find a way out of this trap?" "Not desperate enough to ever resort to violence," I said. No, we won't commit a crime, at least I don't think so. But I have an idea that might solve your problem." For the next hour, we sat together and talked. Several times I told him that he was crazy and that there was no way we could make it through this. I pointed out to him that even if we did this, nothing would come of it. I reminded him that if things went badly, Carol would file for divorce and be vindictive as hell. In response to my words, Lou simply continued to ask, "So, how much worse will you be than today?" When I thought about it, I realized two things. First of all, I was stuck in a situation that I absolutely could not stand, at least not for long. Secondly, I really had no choice but to do something truly desperate. "Okay, Lou, I'm in." I may have seemed pretty determined when I left the office that day, but on the way to Mrs. Alsop's house to pick up Susan, I began to have doubts. I risk losing my daughter if I try what Lou suggests. Wouldn't it be smarter to just swallow your pride and live as a cuckold? Doing nothing is without a doubt the easiest thing to do. My thoughts and my stomach continued to churn as I brought Susan home and began preparing dinner. This time I turned off the TV. I didn't think I could watch Susan and Ted interact on set, especially after what I saw a few nights ago. As I was getting Susan ready for bed, I was surprised to hear Carol's car pull up. I knew it wasn't her turn to anchor the 10 o'clock news, but I thought she'd stay with Ted, and yet, there she was, walking through the door, scooping Susan into her arms, and carrying her contented daughter to bed. I heard them laughing and giggling as Carol read story after story to her. The sound of her voice brought tears to my eyes. This is how it was at our house before everything went bad. When Carol finally came downstairs, I looked up and said sincerely, "That was nice of you. She really misses you, especially before bed." "I know," she said, "and I missed her too." She had a distant look that made me wonder if she had changed her mind about this new lifestyle she had chosen, but all these hopes were quickly dispelled in the next minute. The look on Carol's face now reminded me of a mother about to lecture her child on an unpleasant topic. "Tom, today I wanted to come home early to tell you about the plan for next week." She took a deep breath and continued. "I'm taking a day off next week. I talked to Don Sanchez and he agreed. In fact, he advised me to take some rest and recuperation. He says our ratings are so high that we can afford it." I was pleasantly surprised. Perhaps a week together will help us repair our marriage. "I'll need to talk to my boss tomorrow, but I think they'll give me the day off," I said. "What did you come up with?" She sighed. "We're not talking about you, Tom. Ted and I are traveling together. We're tired of hiding. This is a chance for us to enjoy each other without worrying about anything else." I was stunned. I sat and looked at her, not believing what I heard. She hurried. "I've already made an agreement with Mrs. Alsop. Next week she will keep Susan at her place all day. All you have to do is drop her off on the way to work and pick her up at the usual time." She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper, which she handed to me. "Here's all the information about where I'll be staying if you need to contact me. I'm sure Susan will be fine, but just in case, we are going to leave on Friday. Maybe you can take Susan to the park this weekend. She likes it. We should be back on Sunday and everything will be back to normal." She looked at me slightly uncertainly. I was still silent. Okay. If you don't have any questions, I'll go to bed early." Then, to my complete amazement, she came up and kissed my head as if I were a little child. "Thank you for taking care of everything, dear," she said and headed up the stairs. Oh God, I thought. This must be the greatest humiliation of my life. I was literally shaking with anger. Now I had no doubt that I needed to do something to regain my manhood. Lou's crazy plan suddenly became my best option. On Friday, I left work early. I definitely wanted to see Carol before she went on her little vacation with Ted Stevenson. I've already made arrangements with Mrs. Alsop to keep Susan overnight. If there is any screaming or cursing, I don't want Susan to be exposed to it. I had already checked Carol's closet this morning and found her suitcases in there, so I knew she would have to go home to pack. This will give me the opportunity I needed. As her car pulled into the driveway, I sat in my favorite chair in the office and waited for her to enter. She opened the door and immediately went look for me. She knew I was home because she saw my car in the garage. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Is Susan okay?" "She's fine," I said soothingly. "She's at Mrs. Alsop's." "Then why are you here?" she asked again. "I wanted to make one more attempt to convince you not to leave with Ted this week," I said. She put her hands on her hips in irritation. "I already told you I'm going to go and have some fun with Ted Stevenson, and there's nothing you can do about it. As soon as we return, everything will be over and we can return to normal. You just need to be patient and give me a chance to get this out of my head." "But Carol," I whined, "what about our wedding vows? How about forget about everyone else? These wedding vows were written for another time and place." "Nobody believes all this crap anymore," she said irritably. "But you're talking about treason, about adultery," I insisted. "I don't want you to disgrace our marriage." Her impatience and irritation were clearly growing. "Tom, we shouldn't discuss this topic anymore. If I want to go and sleep with Ted Stevens, I'll do it whether you like it or not. I want to do this and it has nothing to do with you and me." But I didn't let her finish. "But Carol, what about your fans? All those people who look at you every night? You know they won't approve of what you're doing. I've clearly gone too far. I don't care what my fans think. They are nothing more than a herd of boobies and country bumpkins." "That's what," she continued. "In 6 months or a year, I will leave this shabby town and find work in a real city where the streets do not fall asleep at night. In the meantime, what the rednecks think here means nothing to me. Now please stop pestering me. I've already made my decision. I need to go and pack my things, otherwise I'll be late. And if you hate seeing me with Ted when he comes to pick me up, I suggest you get out of here right now." I stood up, my shoulders slumping. "Sorry, Carol. Forgive me for all." I turned around, walked to my car, and headed to the local tavern. I was shaking and needed to relax. I was on my second beer when Lou walked in the door. "Hey, buddy," he said with a grim smile. "How did it go?" "I don't really know, Lou," I admitted. "I tried to be close. You'll have to come and see everything for yourself." "Not until I hear everything that happened," he said firmly. After he finished his beer, we both got into my car and drove back to my house. As I expected, Carol was long gone. We went into my room and he sat down at my computer. "When did you buy this thing?" "In the Stone Age," he asked. However, with a few keystrokes, he was able to do everything he wanted. "Okay," he said, pointing at me. "Let's see what we have here." He pressed another key and Carol's image filled the screen. We listened as Carol flatly rejected all of my requests to honor her wedding vows and told me exactly what she was going to do with Ted Stevenson. "What kind of bitch?" I heard Lou mutter under his breath. Then he heard Carol express herself about her fans and the city she worked in, and his expression became amused. "She's ours, dude. It's much better than we hoped." When the playback ended, Lou touched a few more keys and we were looking at Carol again, but this time from a different angle. "The second camera is very important," Lou said. "It gives more realism." When the second playback also finished, he sent both files via FTP to his office. Then I pulled out the flash drive and copied it to it. "Back up," he said. Finally, he walked over to the bookshelf behind my chair and removed the 2 small cameras we had so carefully set up that morning. With all that done, we both got into my car and headed back to the tavern so Lou could pick up his car. But when we arrived, he surprised me by insisting that I follow him home. "Edie has a big lunch already prepared, buddy. If you don't come, she'll actually get angry." I had planned to spend the evening alone, but Lou wouldn't hear of it. So I reluctantly pulled in behind his car and followed him to his house. When we walked through the door, Edie came up to me and, without saying a word, hugged me and kissed me on the cheek. I wasn't sure if it was a friendly kiss or a pity kiss, but I appreciated it anyway. I'm sure the dinner was wonderful, but I don't really remember much. Honestly, I was just trying the dishes Edie had prepared while she and Lou exchanged worried glances. After that, they took me to his office, where Lou opened another bottle of wine. We sat and drank until Edie couldn't hold it in anymore. "I'm so angry and disappointed in Carol that I don't know what to say. She always seemed so sweet and loving, and when did she turn into a selfish cheater? Success seems to have changed her, and now she thinks she can do whatever she wants with whoever she wants." She turned sharply to Lou. "Listen, do everything in your power to help Tom. I don't like to take sides when friends get divorced, but this is different. Carol has overstepped her bounds here, and we must help Tom keep his daughter." She looked at her husband again with a piercing gaze. "And if one of those slutty little models or TV presenters you have to work with comes to you, you better say no right away, or I'll come for your balls with a butcher knife." Lou and I chuckled at Edie's threat, but I wasn't sure she was exaggerating just to make her point. We continued talking and drinking until the morning, and finally I collapsed on their couch. I vaguely remember Eddie covering me with a blanket and patting my hand. The next thing I knew was the morning light streaming through their picture window and a terrible taste in my mouth. Lou lent me a toothbrush and his razor, and I did my best to look halfway presentable. By the time I finished, Edie had already prepared a big breakfast, so I sat down with them. That morning, my appetite improved a little. I think the instinct of self-preservation kicked in. When I had finished and thanked them profusely for their kindness, Lou took my hand. "Listen, Tom, leave everything to me. I have a lot of work to do this weekend, and I need to get started. All you have to do is get Susan out and get out of here. I will keep you updated on all developments." "Lou, I don't know what I would do without you," I said sincerely. With these words, I awkwardly hugged him and headed home. I had another thing to do, and I didn't like it. When I got home, I checked our address book to find Ted and Missy Stevenson's number. When I called, of course, Missy answered. "Hi, Missy. This is Tom Bailey, Carol's husband. Can I come and talk to you now?" "Oh, hi, Tom. Yes, I think that's normal." I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We weren't that close, and I knew she was wondering why I wanted to see her. "She'll find out soon," I thought gloomily. On the way to her house, I tried to think of what to say. It is not easy to tell a woman that her husband is cheating on her. The fact that I didn't know Missy very well made everything even more awkward, but I felt I couldn't let what happened next take her by surprise. Missy attended the University of Alabama with Carol and me. She was even in the same sorority as Carol. She seemed nice, but she was 2 years younger than us, so we didn't have much opportunity to interact. I was surprised to learn that she married Ted. To be honest, she wasn't his type. Anyway, we chatted with each other at a few events held at the broadcast station, but Carol and I didn't interact with them anymore. "Except for Carol and Ted," I added bitterly to myself. When I arrived, she greeted me and offered me some snacks. "Just a glass of ice water, please," I asked. I was afraid my mouth would go dry when I told her my grim news. After she brought me the glass, I took a sip and began the task. "Missy, do you know where Ted is?" I asked. "Of course," she said. "He went to a convention of radio presenters. He'll be gone all week." "Why are you asking?" "Missy, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Ted is not at the radio convention. I found out that he and my wife were having an affair, and they both went to the coast for some intimate time." Missy looked at me as if I had slapped her in the face. "It can't be true," she objected. "I saw him off last night." I could tell her mind was moving a mile a minute as she changed her arguments. "He loves me. He wouldn't betray me like that. Another denial flared up. Carol was like a big sister to me. She wouldn't hurt me. Finally, she was exhausted and just looked at me helplessly. "Oh, Tom, are you sure?" I grimly pulled out my cell phone and played a video taken from outside the green room. While watching their little erotic tryst unfold, her eyes turned red, and then she began to cry. I didn't know what to do, so I sat down next to her, put my arm around her shoulders, and began to gently rub her back. "I understand, Missy. I understand." Suddenly she looked up, and anger flared in them. "This bitch seduced him," she exclaimed. "If you had her under control—" But she interrupted her tirade when she saw my stricken face. "Oh, Tom, forgive me, I didn't think so. You also lost your wife, didn't you?" Missy's words brought back all my pain and loss in full force, and my tears started flowing again. We hugged each other helplessly, seeking comfort that was not there. Finally, we parted. She wiped her face with the napkin she brought with the drinks, and then asked me, "What are you going to do now?" I felt I had no choice but to explain the predicament Carol had put me in, especially with regard to Susan. Missy, who had no children, immediately understood the leverage Carol had over me, and took my hand sympathetically. "Oh, Tom, I would never have believed that she could be so cruel, so cold." Then she asked me again, "So what are you going to do?" "Missy, I'm definitely going to file for divorce, but there's still something I need to do to avoid losing Susan. It's probably better if you don't know, in case someone asks you about it later." "You're not going to do anything illegal, are you?" she gasped. "No, but if I succeed, both she and Ted will regret cheating on us." I tried to give her a small smile to reassure her, but I doubt it was convincing. "So what about you?" I asked. "Do you think you two can fix your marriage? After what you just showed me, hearing that this has been going on for who knows how long, finding out that he and this brat are spending a week together, there is no way I can stay with him and keep my head up. In this case, you can use the services of the lawyer I contacted if you don't already have someone you trust," I suggested. She smiled weakly at me. "No, I don't know who to contact. I certainly didn't think I'd need a lawyer. If you contact my lawyer, it could save you some money, and at least he will have all the evidence that I have." I handed her a prepared piece of paper with the name, address, and telephone number of my attorney. "If you contact him on Monday and let him know that you and I are together, he can process your documents at the same time as mine." She accepted the information and nodded. "Missy, I have a huge favor to ask of you." "Which?" she asked nervously. "All I ask is that you don't tell anyone, not your family, not your closest friend, anyone, until you hear from me." I looked straight into her eyes. "If you tell anyone, I might lose my chance to keep Susan." She looked at me very seriously, and I felt that she understood everything. "I won't say a word, Tom. It will be hard to act like nothing happened, but I promise." I thanked her, stood up, and headed towards the door. "Where are you going now, Tom?" she asked. I smiled gloomily at her and said, "I'll pick up my daughter and take her out of town until all this is over." She wished me luck, and I did the same. We'll both need it, I thought. From there, I drove to Mrs. Alsop's house. When I got there, she must have alerted Susan that I was coming, because my little girl met me at the door and jumped into my arms. "Did you have a good time, darling?" I asked her. "Oh, yes, Dad. I spent the night, we had pancakes for breakfast, and then I played with dolls." Hugging Susan, I thanked Mrs. Alsop for keeping her and reminded her that Susan would not be coming to see her next week. Mrs. Alsop looked at me shrewdly and asked, "Is everything all right, Tom?" I looked at Susan and then back at Mrs. Alsop. "I hope so," I said. She nodded and leaned down to kiss Susan on the cheek. "Take care of this little girl. She's the same as mine. And Tom, I will pray for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Alsop. This means a lot to me." With that, I carried Susan to the car and sat her in the back seat. When we returned home, Susan began looking for her mother. "Where is Mom?" she asked when she couldn't find it. I felt my throat tighten as I told her. "Mom had to go on a trip. But you know what? You and I will also go on a trip." "Where are we going, Dad?" she asked excitedly. "We'll visit our grandparents on the farm," I said. She squealed and started dancing. Susan loved my parents and enjoyed watching the animals on their small farm in rural Alabama. "Will we be able to see ducks and piglets?" she asked. "Of course, dear," I told her. "And the sooner we get going, the sooner we can see them." Then I grabbed the bag I had already packed for her, along with my suitcase, and we headed back to the car. I thought about leaving Carol a note about where we would be, but decided against it. She hasn't thought much about me lately. Why should I think about her? It took me a little over an hour to get to my parents' farm, and Susan slept most of the way. But as we turned into their rough gravel driveway, she woke up and started pointing at the horses and cows she could see through the car windows. When we arrived at the house, Mom and Dad came out to meet us, and when I unbuttoned Susan, she ran up to Grandma and demanded that she show her the pets. Mom took her hand and led her to the barn, and only then gave me a worried look. I grabbed my bag, and Dad grabbed Susan's, and we went inside to leave them in my old bedroom. After that, Dad led me into the kitchen and offered me a glass of fruit tea. It was already sweetened, and the taste reminded me of my childhood. Those days seemed very long ago. "Well, Tom, what's going on between you and Carol?" Dad asked directly. He had never been one to talk much, and I could see the worry in his eyes. "Let's take a walk, Dad, and I'll tell you everything. I've been dreading this conversation ever since I called them to ask if we could come and stay for a week. They loved Carol and thought of her as the daughter they never had. I was almost sure it would amaze them." Walking along the fence, I began to tell him the whole vile story. He held back from giving advice through most of it, but I could see the pain in his eyes when he looked at me. Several times he gasped at what I was telling him. When I finally finished, there were tears in his eyes. "I just can't believe Carol did something like that. She was always so sweet to your mother and me, and such a good mother to Susan. How could she become so cruel and selfish?" He turned and looked at me carefully. "You know, I never doubted you, Tom, but couldn't this be some kind of misunderstanding or maybe some kind of joke?" I realized that he was in denial and grasping at straws, but it still hurt me a little. And then I thought, if I were in his place, I would have to ask the same questions. Damn, I still find it hard to believe it myself. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I started the video I shot in the green room, paused it, and gave it to him. "Look, Dad." As he picked up the phone, I reached out and tapped the arrow to start playing. He muttered under his breath, "Actually, I can't make out what—" Oh my God. I saw the picture become clearer for him when Carol's almost naked body slipped out of Ted Stevenson's embrace and began to slide over his torso, reaching for his belt, unbuckling it, and then undoing his pants. I took the phone from him, and he stood helplessly, his shoulders slumped, his face tense. He then grabbed me and hugged me tightly. "Oh, son, I'm so sorry. It hurts me so much to see this, I can't even imagine how you must have felt." We stood there for a few more minutes, then turned around and silently moved into the house. He held my shoulder the whole way. When we approached the house, I turned to him and asked, "Dad, can't you tell Mom yourself?" "I don't think I can do this." He nodded solemnly. "I'll do it," he said. When we returned, Mom and Susan were in the kitchen having a snack. Mom looked at Dad and, seeing his face, got scared. She started to say something, but Dad raised his hand to stop her. "Son," he said, "why don't you take Susan to the pond and let her look at all these ducks?" Hearing his words, Susan jumped up and pulled me by the hand. "Let's go look at the ducks, Dad. We can go, right?" I nodded gratefully to Dad and led Susan to the pond. When we returned to the house, I realized that my mother was crying. When we walked in, she wiped her eyes with a towel, then came over and hugged me tightly. "I love you, Tom. Your dad and I will be by your side no matter what." "Thank you, Mom," I breathed. Looking over her shoulder, I saw Dad and said, "Thank you, Dad. This means so much to me." We stood there for a long time, and the silence clearly began to bother Susan, who could not understand what had happened. So I turned to her and said, "Okay, Susan, let's go unpack. Then we need to wash the dishes and get ready for dinner." This broke the spell. She took my hand and ran to our room, dragging me in tow. I told myself that I would never lose my daughter, no matter what. The next day was Sunday, and we all went to the old Baptist church that Mom and Dad had attended for many years. As they say in the village, I've been a habitual sinner for a long time, but it was nice to be back in church, hearing familiar words and singing some old hymns. That evening, Lou called me. He reported everything he did that weekend. Listening to him, I realized that, no matter what happened, I was lucky to have such a good friend as Lou, and that I would be grateful to him for a very long time. I tried to tell him about this, but I was embarrassed to express my emotions as clumsily as men do in such matters. He sighed. "You would have done it for me," he said, but he knew what I was trying to say, and I understood it. Then his tone changed. "Okay, Tom, so far everything has been just for fun. Are you ready to do this in all seriousness? Once we start, there's no turning back." I didn't answer him right away, pausing to think about what we were about to do. There was no guarantee of success. In fact, even if we succeed, it might still end badly for me. And if this all blows up in my face, it could quickly get very ugly, and I may very well end up working on my parents' farm. But then I thought about everything that had happened in the last 2 weeks. Through no fault of my own, as far as I'm concerned, Carol humiliated me, put me in a position I couldn't bear. Even if I decided to comply with her wishes, there was no guarantee that the situation would not become known to everyone, or would not happen again. And if that happens, what will Susan think of me when she's old enough to understand? I didn't want to be an example of this kind of father for her. No, I thought, Carol has me cornered and I have no choice but to fight back. And by heaven, that's what I'm going to do. "Lou," I said, "let's do this." I think he must have realized what I was just thinking because he remained silent while I sat and thought. But when I told him I was ready, he simply said, "Anyway, Eddie thinks you're doing everything right." Somehow that inspired me a little. Now he threw himself into work. "Do you have access to a computer?" I laughed and said, "My ancestors may live on a farm, but they don't live in the 18th century. Okay, tomorrow I'll call you and tell you where to look." "Why don't you just email me the link?" I said. "I can easily access my email from here." "No," he said. "I don't want a trackable link to this. Just wait for my call tomorrow." With that, we said goodbye, and I left to make sure Susan was fast asleep in her new bed. Watching her became the most important job for me. Lou called me mid-morning on Monday. "When you have a chance to be alone with a computer, go to YouTube and search for WXYY, he told me. "You will find a video. After you watch it, call me back and let me know what you think." Mom and Dad took Susan for a walk, so now was the perfect time. I went to the website and searched for the station. There were a lot of videos that came up, but one that caught my attention was called WXYY co-host Carol Martin shares her personal philosophy on love and marriage. When I clicked the icon, the station's familiar 6 o'clock news theme music came through the speakers, accompanied by the look of the standard screensaver that WXYY used every weeknight. But as the camera moved closer to Carol, her voice faded, and a voice off-screen spoke. Waxy's popular news co-anchor. Carol Martin was recently interviewed about her views on love and marriage. The screen switched to another image of Carol, and I heard her say, "Marriage is an institution that has existed as long as human society, but today it is under attack as never before." I immediately recognized these lines. They were the beginning of a series of entertainment news that the WWXYY channel produced about the growing number of divorces across the country. But instead of continuing the series, which actually aired several months ago, the voiceover returned. "What do you think about the sanctity of marriage, Carol?" Suddenly the scene shifted to my office, where Carol stood and said, "Wedding vows were written for another time and place. Nobody believes any of this crap anymore." The stage froze, and the voiceover returned. "What about fidelity and constancy to your husband? How do you feel about this, Carol?" Carol's image on the screen spoke again. "If I want to go, I will do it, whether you like it or not. And I want to do it." A still image of Ted Stevenson flashed on the screen so that the viewer was in no doubt who Carol was talking about. The invisible announcer returned. What about the views of the community? Do you think most people in Birmingham who watch your news program would agree with you? And Carol spoke again. I don't care what my fans think. They are nothing more than a herd of boobies and country bumpkins. The announcer smoothly filled the sudden silence. This is definitely a controversial point of view, Carol. Are you concerned about how this might affect public opinion? Carol's image on the screen quickly provided the answer. So, in 6 months or a year, I will leave this shabby town and find a job in a real city, where the streets don't fall asleep at night. In the meantime, what the rednecks think here means nothing to me. Without a hint of irony or condemnation, the invisible voice continued. So, are you in the mood for a sexual relationship with your co-host, Ted Stevenson? Carol's answer was clear. I already said I'm going to go and have some fun with Ted Stevenson, and there's nothing you can do about it. But this time, instead of Carol talking to me in my office, her voice accompanied the video I took on my phone in the green room. And just like my father, the scene moved from two figures intertwined in the dark to a clear image of a scantily clad Carol kneeling down and beginning to undress the unmistakable figure of Ted Stevenson. The stage froze on erotic paintings, and the voiceover returned for the last time. Now, the only question on Birmingham viewers' minds is, where are Carol and Ted hanging out this week? The WXYY news ending theme song then appeared, and the screen showed a view of the news set with empty chairs, and the video faded out. I sat back in my chair, filled with a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I grabbed the phone and called Lou. He obviously recognized my number because he immediately answered the phone saying, "Well, what do you think?" "Oh my gosh, Lou, you're a genius. It will be cruel. This video will cut through her career like carving a knife through a Thanksgiving turkey." "Pretty good, huh?" "I have to admit, I'm proud of it," he said happily. I felt a pang of guilt remembering what I had just seen. "Do you think we weren't too rude to her?" "Listen," he said decisively, "did she say all this to your face or not?" "Yes," I answered, "but—" "No buts," he interrupted. "She has turned into some kind of selfish monster, and we need to show it to the rest of the world." Then his tone changed. "Listen, Tom, at heart, you are a good guy. I often think that you would rather suffer yourself than make someone else suffer. But if you don't do this, it won't be you who will suffer, but Susan. She will grow up with Carol as her role model. You don't want that, do you?" I swallowed hard. "You're right, Lou. I really have no choice. Thank you for helping me keep my head straight." "Now," I said, "what do we do next? Will we send out mass emails with a link to the video, or what?" The beauty of the virus is that you don't have to do anything special to spread it. Once a source of infection appears, the virus spreads without any help until quite soon an epidemic develops. This video is our source of infection. I can hint to a couple of people that they like to gossip, but from there it will spread on its own. You just need to be patient. Okay, Lou, you understand this. Just keep me posted. Over the next few days, Susan and I had a wonderful time visiting Mom and Dad. Susan had been to the farm before, but only for a day or two at a time. Now that we had a whole week to ourselves, Dad and I wanted to really show her how the farm works so Susan would know where our food comes from. At the same time, Mom took Susan into the kitchen and introduced her to cooking. Our home-cooked meals were more like open the package and heat the contents than actual cooking. Mom cooked almost everything from scratch, and Susan loved standing on a stool next to her, helping add ingredients and stirring them in large bowls. Overall, it was a wonderful week for Susan, experiencing many things she had not experienced in our city life. Meanwhile, Lou called every day to keep me informed of the snowball that had begun to roll down the mountain towards Susan. On Tuesday, he even chuckled when he told me that Edie had heard about the video from a woman she worked with. On Wednesday, the video was discussed around the table at the weekly Kiwanis meeting that Lou attended. He swore he wasn't the one who brought it up. In Thursday's morning paper, a local media columnist wrote a few short lines vaguely referring to the video in her column. In the end, she said the following. "And the question that's been buzzing around Birmingham this week, where are Carol and Ted now?" When Lou called me on Thursday afternoon, He couldn't contain the joy in his voice. I talked to our media guy who runs WXYY. He said the entire radio station was in panic. They start getting calls from other news outlets trying to interview Carol and Ted about the video, and the WXYY people don't know what to do. Apparently, Don Sanchez also left for a few days this week, and no one knows where he is or how to contact him. On Friday, Lou tipped me off to an article on the media blog Gawker.com. It reported that there had been a furor in Birmingham over two WXYZ news anchors and included a link to a video on YouTube. The article ended with a prediction that heads might roll. That morning, I called my lawyer and told him to file for divorce. I also agreed with him that Carol's formal presentation of papers would take place on Saturday at the Gulf Shores Wellness Center, where she was having fun with Ted. It would cost me extra money, but I thought it was worth it. My hunch was justified because I knew what Lou's next move would be. I also called Missy to let her know that I was filing for divorce and that Carol would be served on Saturday. I asked if she wanted Ted to be honored at the same time. "No," she said calmly. "I plan to do it myself when he finally comes home." I wished her luck. Birmingham's other local TV stations were insanely jealous of EX's success. They caught wind of the rumors earlier in the week, and after watching videos online, smelled blood. Their only problem was how to act out the story. Lou gave them the answer. He told the news producer at the second biggest station that I had filed for divorce. This tidbit was a real news event that they could run on their own without having to report what was essentially gossip. Then my lawyer upped the ante. When a station reporter called to confirm the filing, the attorney told her the papers would be served on Saturday and even indicated the location where it would happen. The dogs suddenly jumped out to hunt. The news director decided the story was too juicy to ignore, so they decided to go all out. The station contacted the court courier assigned to serve Carol, and he agreed to coordinate with them. Once that was decided, the station manager gave permission to send a camera crew and their main reporter to Gulf Shores on Saturday. On Saturday morning, Lou called me with more news. Apparently, Don Sanchez was finally notified. He cut his holiday short and tried to return to Birmingham as soon as possible. Lou's contact at WXYY told him that everyone at the station was terrified. No one knows what's going on. Lou also advised me to be sure to watch the evening news on a competing channel. "I think you'll find it interesting," he said with a wry smile. The thing about Saturday was that it's usually a low-event day, meaning TV channels are often grasping at straws in terms of content. I think that's what happened that Saturday, because the news about Carol and Ted was the main one. The rival host, somewhat oily, appeared on air with a photo of Carol and Ted behind him. This was a photo of a billboard I saw from my office window a week ago. All this week, a lot of people in Birmingham have been wondering, where are Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson from WXYY? Today, in an exclusive story, we managed to find them in Gulf Shores, where they had been hiding all week. The scene shifted to footage of the station's lead reporter, Hilda O'Reilly, a tough, red-haired woman with a shrill voice, striding along the beach towards a couple sunbathing on the sand. Of course, it was Carol and Ted. Neither of them heard the reporter, the cameraman, or the sound guy until Hilda walked up to them both and asked loudly, "Carol Martin, Ted Stevenson, what can you tell us about your relationships and the stories that are circulating in Birmingham?" Carol screamed in surprise and turned to see who was talking to her. When she did this, it became obvious to viewers that she was sunbathing topless. Seeing the small crowd and the video camera, she screamed again and hastily covered her breasts, which were, of course, blurred on the TV screen to meet FCC standards. She turned around to pick up her bikini top, and when she bent over to put it on, it became clear that her panties were a thong. The camera then panned to Ted Stevenson, who was desperately trying to grab his beach towel to cover the tiny swimsuit Speedo was wearing. Having regained some modesty, Carol angrily turned to the red-haired reporter and shouted, "Hilda, what the hell are you doing here? Why are you invading our privacy like this?" This didn't bother Hilda at all. "What can you say about the video that has spread all over the internet?" "Which video?" Carol asked, confused. The one where you tell all the idiots in Birmingham that you're going to have an affair with Ted Stevenson, Hilda replied coldly. Carol began to splutter, and Ted tried to intervene to divert attention from her. However, it was at this moment that the unlikely appearance of a man in a suit and tie on the beach caused everyone to pause. Approaching Carol, he asked loudly, "Are you Carol Bailey Martin?" Carol responded reflexively, "Yes." "Then, Miss Martin," he said, handing her the envelope, "accept the official presentation. Your husband has also instructed me to inform you that the locks on your home have been changed and you are no longer welcome there." Having said this, he calmly turned on his heel and walked off the beach. Carol was stunned for a moment, then anger flashed in her eyes and she screamed, "This son of a bitch!" Being a TV professional, Ted realized the cameras were still rolling, grabbed Carol and warned her in a quiet voice not to say anything more. He grabbed her hand and half led her, half dragged her towards the hotel complex. The camera focused on her shiny, oiled buttocks as she angrily walked away. The local announcer returned to the screen. "And now you see." Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson, who'd been away all week, found themselves sharing a room at a luxury resort in Gulf Shores. And the latest event was that Carol's husband forced her to formally serve divorce papers and kicked her out of the house. We tried to get a comment from her husband, but were unable to contact him. They really couldn't contact me, because Susan and I were safely ensconced at my parents' farm, and I was going to leave it that way for the rest of the weekend. But while this meant that I was safe from prying reporters for the moment, my only means of keeping track of developments was through Lou. Lou learned from his contact at another Birmingham television station that Carol had foolishly not believed the court courier when he told her I had changed the locks, so she asked Ted to take her to us. This was a double mistake because not only did her key no longer work in the door, but other TV news stations stationed a camera crew to monitor the house, and her embarrassment and frustration was captured on camera. But what happened next was even worse. Then she and Ted drove to his house, without thinking about the consequences. Missy met Ted at the door with a package of her divorce papers and told him not to come back. A film crew was also there, and Ted's humiliation was included in the news for everyone to see. In desperation, the two sped off, trying to throw reporters off their trail, and ended up spending the night in a motel off Interstate 65, halfway to Tennessee. Lou had to rely on our media manager, who in turn learned everything from his contact at WXYY. On Saturday afternoon, Don Sanchez, WXYY's news director, finally returned to Birmingham and tried unsuccessfully to contact Carol and Ted. They returned from Gulf Shores, naturally, with their cell phones turned off so as not to be hassled by other reporters. Don couldn't even leave a message. Carol and Ted's mailboxes were full of voicemail. The result of all this was a very angry news director. His mood didn't improve when someone showed him a tape of his rival network's exclusive Saturday evening news. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that Ted thought to call the office, and Don ordered both co-anchors to come to the studio immediately. The two of them got into Ted's car and immediately headed to the WXYY studios. When they arrived, they found a remote broadcast van from a rival station parked across the street, so they had to drive to the back of the building and sneak into the service elevator. The result of this little maneuver was that they walked recklessly and unannounced into a meeting that Don was holding with the rest of his staff. Apparently, the screaming started immediately as Don criticized the couple for their stupid, slutty behavior, and Carol and Ted tried to defend themselves. Eventually, Don had enough, and in front of the entire group, he told Carol and Ted that they were fired. "What?" Carol squealed. "You can't do this! We have a contract!" Don went into executive mode and answered very calmly, "If you check your contracts, you will see that they have a morality clause that requires you to behave in accordance with the standards of the community." "What we do in private is no one's business," Carol snapped. Don, a practicing Catholic, stood up and leaned toward her over his desk. "When I went to Mass in the cathedral this morning, the priest preached about the sanctity of marriage and the sin of adultery. He did not mention the two of you by name, but referred to the bad example set by some public figures in our city. Carol recoiled at the thought of being the subject of local preaching, but Ted was still outraged and rushed into places where smart heads would have remained silent. But no one knows about us or is interested in us. Now Don has become sarcastic. Obviously, you didn't see the news on other news channels last night. I suggest you pick up a copy and watch it, but there's no reason to wait for it. Just look out the window. With these words, he went to the window behind his desk and pulled back the curtain. There was one of the billboards across the street with pictures of the now infamous co-hosts. Carol glanced quickly at the sign, then read it carefully. "Oh my God!" she gasped. A hooligan with nerves of steel and a can of spray paint was correcting the poster. He had done little more than erase some of the text, but now the sign proudly said, "Birmingham's choice for the 6 o'clock news girl. Don't let the curtain fall and turn back to the now silent couple." In an official tone, he said, "Your behavior has embarrassed our channel and caused irreparable harm to our ratings and our reputation. I have no choice but to throw you off the air and terminate your contracts immediately." He paused and then said bitterly, "Have you ever seen The Real Frankenstein?" Confused by the change of topic, they nodded uncertainty. "Well, right now," Don continued, "you are monsters, and the people of Birmingham are an angry mob. If I were you, I would leave the city as quickly as possible. I was very worried when Susan and I drove back to Birmingham on Sunday evening. I deliberately left late, hoping to avoid any confrontation with Carol or the media. As a result, I learned about Carol and Ted's firing on the Sunday evening news. But when I pulled up to our garage, it turned out that, having won a famous victory, the opposing news teams had decided to leave the battlefield. I also got lucky the next morning when the Birmingham News headlined a new scandal involving a city politician caught using public funds. The story relegated Ted and Carol to the back pages and began a new witch hunt for reporters. Apparently, no one cared about the reaction of the angry husband anymore. That morning, I took Susan to Mrs. Alsop's house. When I got there, Mrs. Alsop met me at the door and hugged Susan. "Go, honey," she told her. "My children missed you. They want to play." As Susan ran off to her little friends, Mrs. Alsop turned to me with sympathy. "I was so sad to hear about everything that happened, Tom. I hope everything goes well with you and Susan." I thanked her for her compassion, but I really didn't have an answer to how things would work out for us. In fact, I noted that she did not include Carol in her interests. When I arrived at the office, everyone was nice, but I could see that they were avoiding me. It's like I have an incurable disease and no one knows what to say. The exception, of course, was Lou. He hugged me and I hugged him tightly too. "You are a genius," I told him. "You are a great viral campaign artist." "Well," he said, "it worked better than we could have hoped. The only bad thing is that we will never be able to tell anyone about what we did." "That's even good," I replied. "I know it will come back to me, and I'm ready for it." By now, Carol must have figured out that I was supposed to be the source of that video and will be chasing me with guns blazing. I don't want you to get caught in the crossfire. As it turned out, I was too pessimistic in my expectations. Later that week, my lawyer called me and told me that Carol had decided not to contest the divorce. "But why?" I asked him. "She already told me what she would do if I filed for divorce." "What happened?" "I spoke with Carol's attorney and she told me the rest of the story," he said. "Carol wanted to countersue for divorce and also sue you for invasion of privacy, but her lawyer talked her out of it. She pointed out that there are legal questions about whether a person can legally record their spouse's conversation. These issues become even more confusing when one of the spouses is a TV presenter, that is, a very public figure. She essentially told Carol that her lawsuit might have to go all the way to the Supreme Court before a final decision was made. She also reminded Carol that she isn't such a popular figure these days. She will have a hard time finding a sympathetic jury to hear her case." "But what about Susan?" I asked. "Carol swore she would take her from me." My lawyer snorted. "Tom, your future ex-wife is unemployed. Her chances of resuming her career not only in Birmingham but also in the state of Alabama are absolutely zero. In fact, I don't think she can get airplay working anywhere in the Southeast after getting so much publicity. Now she is the epitome of an unfaithful wife. With a reputation for immorality, no steady job, and no prospects in the entire region, what judge would award her custody of a small child? The point is, Carol will leave town as quickly as she can. You will still have to share the proceeds of the house with her when it is sold, which could happen any time between now and when Susan turns 18. And Carol still has visitation rights on holidays and birthdays. But she gives you custody because she has no hope of getting anything else. The only thing she wants is to be allowed into the house to get her personal belongings before she leaves town. And one more thing, Tom, she would like to be able to talk to you when she comes to your house. If she signs the papers under these terms, I think I can talk to her before she leaves town, I told him. We agreed that this would take place at the end of the week, and so it happened. In fact, I got everything I wanted. No, that's not true. What I actually wanted was for my life and my family to be back together the way they were before this whole terrible mess happened. But this was wishful thinking. Once an avalanche starts, nothing can really stop it. But at least I still had my daughter, and that was the only thing that really mattered to me. The next evening, Lou, Edie, and I celebrated at dinner. Susan had been with us and was now sleeping in one of her beds while the adults continued the party. It wasn't really a party, but just a chance for the three of us to reflect on everything that had happened. I brought a bottle of the most expensive champagne I could find to toast my friends and thank them for their loyalty. Edie, in turn, raised a glass to the two of us. "Guys," she said, "when I heard about your scheme, I thought you were crazy. I thought everything would go wrong and our hands would be dirty. The only thing that kept me from objecting was the fact that you," here she saluted me, "are fighting for your little girl, and you have no one else to turn to. And you, my loving husband, were so sure that you could make it happen. So here's to you both, for fighting when you have to and winning despite great odds." To your health, Lou and I agreed in unison. I felt like there was one more thing I had to do before this whole dirty mess could be considered over, and that was to check on Missy Stevenson. If there was an innocent bystander, it was her, but I knew she was suffering as much as anyone else, and I felt a little guilty for getting her into this mess, even though I had no choice, and even though Ted was the real culprit. But at least I had the opportunity to decide to act. Missy never expected this. I called to ask if I could come over and she invited me to lunch, so I felt like she shouldn't be too mad at me. We met at a quiet restaurant next door, and after the waiter took our orders, I asked how she was doing. "Not very well, I'm afraid, Tom," she replied. "I still can't believe that all this happened. One minute I was happily married to a handsome, successful TV presenter, and the next moment I was divorcing the bastard who lied, cheated, and humiliated me in front of the entire city. I know, Missy," I consoled her. "This is all so incredible. I feel like I've been transported to a bad daytime TV soap opera." She wanted to know what was going on between me and Carol, so I told her how our divorce ended. "Okay," she said vindictively. "She got exactly what she deserved." "What about Ted?" I asked her. "What's going on between you two?" "That coward," she replied bitterly. "He didn't have the courage or the courtesy to face me. He just left town, telling his lawyer to give me whatever I wanted. I have no idea where he went, and I don't care. Except, of course, that I keep waking up at night and reaching for him before I even remember what happened." She pulled out a handkerchief and wiped her eyes. "Are you okay financially?" I asked. "Yes and no," she said. "He left me a house, but it's too big for me to live in alone. And we have a large mortgage, but no real equity, so I don't think I can afford to keep it for myself. Ted was supposed to pay me child support, but to be honest, I don't expect that. He will only be able to pay if he finds a new job, and my friends warned me that this would not be easy for him to do." She sighed. "In general, I think that the most reasonable thing for me is to return to my parents for a while, try to find a job, and start rebuilding my life." She stopped. "This is not how my life was supposed to turn out," she said sadly. She made me feel terrible. She was a sweet girl who did nothing to deserve this. I begged her to stay in touch with me and let me know where she would end up. I really liked Missy, and I hoped that luck would smile on her. She deserved it. All that was left was Carol's visit, and I wasn't looking forward to it. The anger and resentment I had previously felt subsided after the success of our viral video campaign. I felt like I had regained at least some of my manhood, and now I no longer had to fight her or gloat about my victory. As a result, I decided to do something nice for Carol. I arranged everything so that when Carol arrived, Susan would be with me. As Carol stepped out of the SUV she had rented to transport her clothes and other personal items, I saw a frown on her face. But when I opened the door and let Susan run up to her, the frown turned into a smile and happy tears. As Susan wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and hugged her desperately, Carol looked at me and whispered, "Thank you." They went inside and Carol played with Susan for quite a while. Officially, the visit was only supposed to last an hour, but having decided that Susan would be with me, I mentally threw that time out the window. Once Susan had exhausted everything she wanted to show and tell her mother, Carol suggested that she go up to her room and play alone. "I'll be there soon, baby. We have to talk to Dad first." As soon as Susan left, Carol turned to me somewhat reluctantly and said, "Thank you for this. I really didn't expect you to let me see her." I simply nodded. Carol's mood changed noticeably. "I can't believe you did all this to me. You used a private conversation between us to destroy me, to make me the laughingstock of the city. How could you do this?" I sighed. "Carol, I don't want to quarrel with you anymore. It won't do anything for either of us." "It's easy for you to say," she retorted. "You are a winner. You deprived me of my job, my family, and my future, all to protect your fragile little ego." "Carol, I said I don't want to fight with you, and I really don't. I just want you to think about one thing. Nothing would have happened if you had not decided to satisfy your personal wants, regardless of anyone or anything. Everything that happened you brought upon yourself." Carol opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment Susan called out to her, asking when she was going upstairs. Carol looked at me for a moment longer, then turned and walked towards her daughter. After playing in Susan's room for a while, Carol took her daughter into our bedroom and began packing up her things while continuing to talk to Susan. I heard their joyful chatter from below. Finally, Carol came back downstairs, dragging her suitcases, with Susan following behind them. Carol set her bags on the floor and then turned and knelt in front of her daughter. Taking Susan by the shoulders, Carol said to her, "Mom needs to leave. I'll be living in another state and won't be able to see you every day. But I promise that I will see you every chance I get, and we can talk on the phone and film each other as much as we want." Susan's cry was immediate and sincere. "No, Mommy, I don't want you to leave." The little girl grabbed her mother by the neck and pressed herself against her as if she were the only life raft on the ocean. Carol picked her up and stood up, hugging her tightly, supporting her back and trying to calm her down. "It's okay, doll. I'll see you soon, and you'll tell me all about what you did, and we'll have such a good time." As she spoke, she walked up to me and handed me over to Susan. "Now be a good girl and do everything your daddy tells you. I love you, Susan. Never forget that." Then she turned, picked up her suitcases, and quickly walked to the door. I saw tears streaming down her face, but she did not allow herself to look back. Instead, she walked straight to her car, loaded her bags into the back, and quickly waved. I held my sobbing daughter as my own tears streamed down my cheeks. I was amazed to realize that they came from a loss no less than my daughter's. My little girl was losing her mother, and I was losing my wife. Finally, I placed Susan. "Listen," I said. "I have an idea." "What, Dad?" she asked with tears in her eyes. "Why don't we go to the park and see if there are any more ducks there? And after we do that, maybe we can find an ice cream vendor and buy a cone from him." "Oh, yes," she answered immediately. "And we can feed the cones to the ducks, can't we, Dad?" "Of course we can," I replied. It was a great relief to take Susan's mind off her grief. I knew there would be many more times when she would miss her mother and the feminine presence in our home. but I hoped that what I heard was true. Young children are more resilient and adapt to change more quickly than older ones, and I thought with regret that I hoped I could adapt too. The next week, I learned that I would have to adapt even more than I expected. Late one evening, the head of the agency called me into his office. "Tom," he began, "you have done an excellent job for us, and we truly appreciate your contribution to the success of the agency. I was just waiting for the but that I knew was coming. I didn't think I would like the direction it was going. But all this business with your wife has left a smell that sticks to everything around. Clients ask if you are Carol's husband, and it affects them even when I tell them about your situation. Not surprisingly, our relationship with WXYY is also quite tense, and for us, they are a key media outlet." "Are you firing me?" I asked him directly. I was furious and did not want to listen to 15 minutes of wagging around the bush. "No way," he said decisively. "But I've talked to some of the other executives, and we think it's best for you and the agency if you decide to take a job elsewhere." "How much time do I have?" I snapped. "There is no deadline," he assured me. "You have as much time as you need. And listen, Tom, I'd be happy to give you a great letter of recommendation. I hope this helps you find something quickly." I did not like it. It was unfair. But I knew that there was no point in burning bridges behind my back, so I shook his hand, assured him that I understood and would begin the search immediately, and also thanked him for the offer of a letter. Then he returned to his office. On the way, I went into Lou's office and closed the door. "How are you doing, buddy?" he asked. "I just got off work," I told him. "It seems that, with all the fuss we've been putting on the city, it's gotten too hot for the city's top brass." Then I told him about my conversation with the boss. "It's bullshit," he barked. "I'll go to him and express my opinion." "They can't do this to you, especially after everything you've been through." I grabbed him by the shoulders and guided him back into the swivel chair. "You will do nothing but remain silent. I don't like being thrown overboard, but going into this, I knew it was risky. I won't let you hurt yourself. You've already done too much for me." I could see that he was not happy about this, but he began to calm down and allowed me to talk him out of any conflicts. We ended the conversation when I promised that I would come to him for dinner on Saturday. I said I would come if I could bring a girl with me, and he looked shocked until I explained that she was only 4 years old. I then went back to my office and started updating my resume. As I worked on it, I shook my head sadly. Looks like Missy wasn't the only collateral damage. I made a number of contacts at other agencies in the Birmingham area and immediately started calling them. However, after speaking with several of them, I realized that, as a result of the fallout from Carol and Ted's affair, my stock in the area had been ruined. Personally, everyone liked me, but no one was ready to touch me, even with a 3-meter pole. It's time to expand the search range. I ended up going back to my old agency in Mobile. It was far enough away that the scandal wouldn't reach me there, and the agency was happy to receive a proven product with experience in big cities. Of course, I had to sell my house in Birmingham, and although the market there was better than in many other places, I left with nothing to show for my capital. And of course, what I received had to be shared with Carol. Carol, of course, did not disappear from our lives. She started calling Susan every week and quickly switched to Skype so they could see each other. Neither of them was happy that everything was limited to electronic contact, but personal meetings were out of the question because Carol now lived in Santa Ana, California. Apparently, our video attack on Carol had a greater impact than we even imagined. At job interviews, she was asked questions about her fiasco even outside the Southeast. She continued her search in the West, but still could not escape her reputation. Eventually, she came to the conclusion that it was time to put her dreams of becoming a TV presenter on hold. She managed to find a job teaching television journalism at Santa Ana College in California. The job did not offer a high salary or the excitement of being a presenter, but she was grateful that she could work in a related field. When I finally reconnected with my old agency in Mobile, the next challenge facing me was finding a home to live in. My new employer put me in touch with a real estate agency, and they assigned new agent Marilyn Elliott to show me some properties. I was supposed to meet her at the first house on the list, and when I arrived at the address, she beat me to it because she arrived at the front door while I was still parking. Something about her seemed strangely familiar, although the name Marilyn Elliott meant nothing to me. When I got close enough to be sure, I cried out in surprise, "Missy Stevenson!" She smiled and came over to greet me. "What a pleasant surprise, Tom. When I saw your name, I wondered if it could be you, but I decided it was just a coincidence. Oh, and Marilyn Elliott is my maiden name, but everyone who knows me still calls me Missy." Missy had a list of half a dozen houses to show me, and as we moved from one to the next, we used the time to catch up, talking about everything that had happened over the past few months. I didn't know that Missy's family lived in Mobile, where she moved shortly after Ted left. Apparently, she has started a new career in housing. I, in turn, told her my story, which ended with my leaving the Birmingham agency and subsequent move to Mobile. When I mentioned Susan and the need to find her a preschool, Missy perked up. "I know some places that I'm sure would be ideal for her," she told me. "I also know of some great children's activities in the area that I bet she'll enjoy. You'll have to introduce her to me." Then she blushed, perhaps feeling too pushy. I was glad to receive any help that would help Susan move to a new home and area. I found myself thoroughly enjoying our conversation, and as our day and the day's search came to an end, I found myself asking Missy if she could join me for dinner, of course, to just talk about the houses we saw. She quickly agreed. I never really paid much attention to Missy before. She was 2 years behind Carol and I, which meant I had only limited contact with her. And when Carol joined WXYY, Missy married Ted. But now, listening to it over dinner, I found myself interested. She was always pretty, but in a girl-next-door kind of way, not as glamorous as Carol. Now I found her not only attractive, but also smart and easy to talk to. She wasn't being simpering, but she expressed her opinion simply and seriously. After being around many TV personalities for a long time, I found Missy's simplicity and naturalness very endearing. Our conversation turned to real estate, and she asked me which of the houses we saw today was my favorite. I said I liked some of them, then asked her which one would she recommend. I expected her to recommend the most expensive one we saw. She was a commission salesperson after all, but she surprised me when she pointed out a listing for a more modestly priced house. "Why this one?" I asked. "Oh," she said innocently, "I just like to live here." Then she realized what she had said and became embarrassed. And an uninvited thought flashed through my head. But this could be good. I won't go into detail. Missy and I got married, and yes, we did live in a house that she liked. I was worried about how Susan would get along with Missy, but my fears turned out to be unfounded. I learned that Missy had wanted to have children since she and Ted got married, but Ted had refused, feeling that a child would slow down his career. So when she met Susan, it was love at first sight. As for Susan, it was obvious that there was a lack of female influence in her life. When Missy started showing up in our house, Susan clung to her, feeling like a fish out of water. Even before we got married, Susan already called her Mama Missy, and soon she abandoned the prefix Missy altogether. The summer after we got married, I did something that I thought I should have done a long time ago. The three of us flew to Los Angeles so Susan could see Carol again. My plan was simple. Susan would spend a week with Carol while Missy and I went sightseeing in Los Angeles. Neither of us had been there before, and we really wanted to be the typical tourists. At the end of the week, the three of us will reunite and fly home to Mobile. I was afraid to broach the subject with Missy. No second wife could be all that happy about her husband seeing his first again. Besides, Missy had every reason to hate Carol, given everything that had happened. But when I hesitantly brought up the topic, Missy simply said, "I think this is a great idea. I think she was more secure in our marriage than I thought, and perhaps handled what happened a little more maturely than I did." Anyway, we arrived at John Wayne Airport, and Carol came to meet us. Although I had seen her face many times on Skype, I almost didn't recognize her standing in the terminal. She had her hair cut short and was wearing what I would call business casual attire. It turned out that a lot has changed. Susan suddenly became very shy, clinging to Missy's waist and hiding her face. But Missy gently pushed her towards her mother and whispered encouraging words in her ear. Finally, Susan let go and hesitantly moved towards Carol, picking up speed as she got closer to her, and finally hugged her. Carol cried profusely, and Susan was confused and worried at first. "I'm so glad to see you," her mother assured her, and they hugged each other tightly. Carol looked at Missy and me and said thank you to each of us. I couldn't help but remember the parting scene when Carol left Birmingham for the last time. This time, the four of us headed to baggage claim together. When Susan stopped to admire some trinkets in one of the airport windows, Carol turned to us. "I know we don't have much time, but I want to apologize to both of you. I've been thinking a lot over the past couple of years and even went to see a therapist. She helped me understand what I became during my time in pursuit of fame and how much pain I caused those around me in the process, especially you two. You probably won't be able to forgive me, but I hope that at least you won't hate me." Missy and I looked at each other and then hugged Carol in unison. It felt good to let a lot of things disappear. After we returned from holiday one evening, I called Birmingham. When Edie answered, I talked to her a little about our lives and then asked Lou to come on the phone. When he approached, we exchanged pleasantries, and then I told him why I was calling. "You were once ready to take risks for me. Are you ready to do it again?" "What the hell are you talking about, Tom?" "I'm talking about you quitting your job, moving here and starting the Bailey and Faraday advertising agency. What do you say?" "There's only one way I'll ever accept something this crazy," my old friend replied. "And what is it?" "We'll have to change our name to Faraday and Bailey." We both laughed and started making plans. After the way I was treated at the old agency, Lou didn't like it there. He wanted something new, and my call was just in time. We brought them both to Mobile, and Missy helped them find a beautiful home near us. The fact that she refused to take her commission from them made the price a little easier for them. Soon after Lou and I opened our office, we began offering our services to potential clients. This guy was actually hooked by our approach. "Yes," he said, "I wanted to try a different approach, something that would make us stand out from the crowd. Maybe some kind of viral campaign. Could you guys handle something like this?" Lou and I just smiled at each other. "Yes," I said, "we can handle this. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one."